June 22, 1941. 625,000 German trucks and 600,000 horses crossed into the Soviet Union to supply 3 million men across distances that would stretch to thousands of kilometers. By February 1943, 30% of that truck fleet was gone. By May 1945, only 20% remained serviceable, and 1.1 million horses had died in their traces. The Wehrmacht that invaded Russia moved supplies at 4 kilometers per hour, the same speed as Napoleon's army, and the Maultier half-tracks that tried to save it, brilliant tracked conversions that could conquer the mud, arrived in numbers representing just 10% of the fleet. This is every type of German supply truck used on the Eastern Front, and the story of how Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner's 200-kilometer rule predicted the catastrophe before the 1st Panzer crossed the border. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb commanded Army Group North. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock led Army Group Center. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt drove Army Group South. Between them, 3 million men, and supporting those men, 625,000 trucks faced off against 600,000 horses. The numbers look almost equal, but they tell opposite stories. A standard German infantry division in 1941 possessed 942 motor vehicles. Impressive on paper, but 80% of that division's supply transport still depended on horses pulling wagons. The Panzer divisions created the illusion of full mechanization. Their tanks roared forward, their half-tracks carried infantry, their reconnaissance units sped ahead in armored cars. But the bulk of the German army, the infantry divisions that made up 70% of the force, moved at the speed of a walking horse. 4 kilometers per hour. The same pace as Frederick the Great's army. The trucks existed, but they existed in numbers that could never replace what the horses did. And those trucks were about to meet an enemy that no amount of armor plating could defeat. The Opel Blitz 3.6-ton variant became the backbone of German logistics on the Eastern Front. Over 150,000 rolled off assembly lines, more than any other German truck model. It carried 3 tons of cargo in its wooden bed, enough for ammunition crates, fuel drums, rations, medical supplies, everything an army needed to keep fighting. The engineers rated its range at 400 kilometers on a full tank. But that number assumed perfect roads and no combat conditions. In reality, the effective operational radius collapsed to 150 kilometers. Mud ate fuel. Detours around destroyed bridges ate fuel. Idling in traffic jams behind horse-drawn columns ate fuel. The German quartermaster's office noted the Opel Blitz was perfect for light delivery work, the kind of short hauls it had done across France and the Low Countries. But Russia wasn't France. The distances were incomprehensible. A round trip to a forward unit and back to the railhead consumed 12 hours of driving time, and that assumed nothing went wrong. The earlier 1.5-ton Opel Blitz variant, 50,000 units produced, handled rear area logistics, shuttling supplies between major depots. Useful, but too light for the heavy lifting the Eastern Front demanded. The 3.6-ton model became the workhorse, the truck that crews cursed and depended on in equal measure. It could do the job, but only if the job stayed within its limits. And the Eastern Front respected no limits. The Opel Blitz didn't work alone. 40,000 Mercedes-Benz L, 3,000 trucks competed directly for the same cargo duties, carrying 3 tons through the same terrible conditions. 20,000 Ford V, 3,000 trucks came from the German Ford branch, some equipped with all-wheel drive for rough terrain, though most still used standard rear-wheel drive that proved useless in mud. 15,000 MAN E, 3,000 trucks provided military-spec logistics columns, built tough but no better in Rasputitsa than anything else. The heavy haulers arrived in smaller numbers. 10,000 Busing Nag 500 trucks pulled ammunition trailers, rated for 5-ton loads, designed to keep the artillery supplied. 5,000 Busing Nag 4,500 A trucks specialized in fuel delivery to panzer formations, rugged 4.5-ton vehicles that could theoretically handle the punishment. 8,000 Steyr 640 trucks came from Austria after annexation, 6 wheel-drive beasts with excellent mobility, used for radio equipment and troop transport. Over 10,000 Skoda 256 trucks supplemented German production after Czechoslovakia disappeared from the map. Sturdy Czech engineering pressed into service for the Reich, and this created the nightmare. 20 different truck types, each requiring different spare parts, different maintenance procedures, different training for mechanics. A supply sergeant trying to fix a broken Mercedes couldn't cannibalize parts from a nearby Steyr. A Ford mechanic couldn't help with a Bussing-Nag engine problem. The Wehrmacht had diversity where it needed standardization, and every broken truck that sat waiting for the right part was a truck that wasn't delivering supplies. The Quartermaster Corps called it dizzying. The troops called it worse. General Eduard Wagner understood numbers. As Quartermaster General from 1941 through 1944, he managed truck procurement, maintenance schedules, fuel allocation, everything that kept the army moving. And he warned everyone who would listen about the 200-kilometer limit. German doctrine built the entire logistics system around railroads. The plan was simple: advance the railheads to within 200 kilometers of the front line, then use trucks and horses to bridge that final gap. Wagner's calculations showed why 200 kilometers was the maximum. A panzer division sitting idle consumed 30 tons of supplies per day. Food, fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, medical supplies, all of it had to flow forward constantly. But when that same panzer division went into combat, consumption exploded to 700 tons per day. Fuel for the tanks, shells for the guns, bullets for the infantry. The appetite was bottomless. The gross transport tram supply columns, the organized truck convoys, could deliver a maximum of 20,000 tons per day per army group under perfect conditions. Wagner's memo from June 1941 laid it out plainly. A supply run from a railhead 200 kilometers behind the front took 12 hours of driving time for the round trip. That left almost no margin for delays, breakdowns, or enemy action, and every kilometer beyond 200 doubled the problem. By July 1941, at Smolensk, the front had already advanced beyond that critical distance. The trucks couldn't keep up. The math didn't work. Wagner knew it, and nobody listened. Smolensk sits at 53.8 degrees north, 32 degrees east. July 1941. Army Group Center's panzers smashed through Soviet defenses and created a massive encirclement. Textbook blitzkrieg. But behind the victory, the supply situation reached crisis. The Panzer spearheads had jumped so far forward that the Opel Blitz and Mercedes L 3000 trucks couldn't match their pace. The trucks hauled ammunition and fuel from railheads that hadn't moved in weeks, trying to reach tank units that advanced dozens of kilometers every day. A panzer division in combat demanded 700 tons daily. The trucks could barely deliver a fraction of that. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, watched his triumphant advance grind down from lack of supplies. His diary entry was bitter. The supply situation is catastrophic. Trucks cannot keep up with the infantry, not the panzers. The infantry. The foot soldiers moving at walking speed were outpacing the motorized logistics, and 80% of the supplies for those non-motorized divisions still moved on horse-drawn wagons, which couldn't match the pace either. Smolensk was supposed to be the gateway to Moscow. Instead, it became the first place where the German army learned that winning battles meant nothing if you couldn't deliver the bullets to keep fighting. October 8th, 1941. The Rasputitsa arrived. Rasputitsa. The word means roadlessness in Russian, and it's not a metaphor. Autumn rains turned the dirt roads of central Russia, around 55 degrees north and 36 degrees east, into rivers of liquid mud that swallowed everything. Standard rear-wheel drive trucks like the Opel Blitz sank axle deep. Crews tried to push them out. The mud pulled them back in. Tried to winch them. The mud held tight. The roads became impassable bogs that stopped mechanized warfare dead. Up north, in the Lake Ilmen sector of Army Group North at 58 degrees north and 31.2 degrees east, the first major Eastern Front mud tests destroyed 50% of the truck fleet through terrain alone. Not combat, not mechanical failure, just mud. The heavy bussing NAG 500 trucks attempted to pull 10-ton ammunition trailers through the muck. They bogged down completely, their rear wheels spinning uselessly, digging themselves deeper with every revolution. The railhead supply limit of 200 kilometers, already exceeded in the summer advance, now became meaningless. Trucks couldn't reach forward units at all. Panzer formations sat immobilized, not from enemy action, but from empty fuel tanks. The horses tried to pick up the slack. They failed too. A horse can't pull a wagon through axle-deep mud any better than a truck can drive through it. The entire German logistics system, horse and machine alike, drowned in October mud, and winter was coming. October 1941. Somewhere in the German motor pool, an unnamed Opel engineer looked at the problem and saw a solution. Take the Opel Blitz chassis, the reliable 3-ton truck that was sinking in mud everywhere. Remove the rear wheels. Replace them with continuous tracks borrowed from captured French tank designs. Keep the front wheels for steering. The result? The SDKFZ 3 Opel Maultier. Maultier means mule in German, and the nickname fit perfectly. A mule can carry loads through terrain that would stop a horse or a truck. The Maultier half-track could haul 3 tons of cargo through mud that swallowed wheeled vehicles completely. The tracked rear section distributed weight across a larger surface area, preventing the sinking that doomed standard trucks. The front wheels provided steering control that pure tracked vehicles lacked. Initial prototype tests near Moscow in late October proved the concept worked. The Maultier maintained the Opel Blitz's 150-kilometer effective radius, even in Rasputitsa conditions, something no wheeled truck could match. It could go where the army needed it to go. But there was a problem. Actually, 2 problems. First, mass production wouldn't begin until 1942, a full year into the campaign. Second, even when production ramped up, the numbers would never be enough. The Maultier was brilliant engineering, solving the wrong war. By the time it arrived in quantity, the German army needed 10 times as many vehicles, not a clever solution for a fraction of the fleet. November 1941. The thermometer dropped below minus 30 Celsius. The approach to Moscow at 55.7 degrees north and 37.6 degrees east became a frozen hell. Truck engines seized solid overnight. Hydraulic systems froze into useless blocks of ice. Crews tried to start vehicles in the morning and discovered the oil had turned to sludge. The cold killed trucks as efficiently as the mud had. Horses died by the hundreds of thousands from cold, starvation, and overwork. The survivors, starving and desperate, ate the corpses of dead horses. German supply columns became scenes from a medieval nightmare. Frozen men leading skeletal horses past the bodies of animals that had died pulling supply wagons. Captured Gaz AA trucks, Soviet copies of the Ford Model AA, supplemented the German Opel Blitz fleet in rear areas. Over 100,000 seized from retreating Soviet forces. They proved more reliable in extreme cold than their German counterparts. Soviet engineers had designed them for Russian winters. German trucks averaged 12-hour round trips for 200-kilometer deliveries in the extreme cold, but fuel consumption doubled. Half the payload burned just getting there and back. December 5th, 1941. The Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow caught the Wehrmacht with massive numbers of trucks, inoperable from cold and mud damage combined. SDKFZ 251/4 half-tracks designed for towing infantry guns, got pressed into emergency supply service. They could move when trucks couldn't, but a Panzer Division's 700-ton daily combat needs went completely unmet. The horses were dying, the trucks were frozen, and the Red Army was attacking. Spring 1942 brought the Maultier to war. The SDKFZ 3A Opel Maultier and SDKFZ 3B Ford Maultier entered mass production, both carrying 3 tons through conditions that stopped everything else. Operation Blue launched June 28, 1942, driving toward Voronezh at 51.7 degrees north and 39.2 degrees east. Army Group South pushed southeast, and the Maultiers proved their worth. July 23, 1942, at Rostov, 47.2 degrees north and 39.7 degrees east, the tracked half-track conversions became standard equipment. The Rasputitsa returned with the summer rains, and the Maultiers kept moving. Over 10,000 Opel Maultier half-tracks and 2,000 Ford Maultier variants rolled off assembly lines by 1943. Crews loved them. They worked. They hauled supplies through mud that left standard trucks stranded. But here's the crushing reality. Despite their success, Maultiers represented only 10% of the German truck fleet. The remaining 90% still consisted of wheeled vehicles or horse-drawn wagons. The Maultier solved the mud problem for 1 truck in 10. The other 9 still sank. The Wehrmacht had created a brilliant solution and deployed it in numbers too small to matter. Operation Blue's advance toward the Caucasus oil fields depended on supply lines that stretched far beyond the 200-kilometer limit. The Maultiers hauled their loads faithfully, but they couldn't compensate for the overall fleet shortages, the worn-out horses, the impossible distances, the fundamental arithmetic of trying to supply a multi-million-man army across thousands of kilometers of terrible roads. The Gaz AA appeared in German service in quantities exceeding 100,000 units. Soviet Ford Model AA copies with 2-ton capacity captured by the tens of thousands during the 1941 advances. They got pressed into German rear area logistics. Mechanics repainted them, slapped Wehrmacht markings on the doors, and sent them hauling supplies. The Gazzeitditra A 6x6 trucks followed, over 50,000 captured, 3-ton capacity, commonly used in occupied territories, where German trucks were needed at the front. Yaji 10 Soviet heavy trucks, captured by the thousands, provided 10-ton capacity for large equipment transport in rear areas. The irony was inescapable. Captured Soviet vehicles supplemented German logistics in substantial numbers throughout 1942 and 43. The Wehrmacht, supposedly the modern mechanized force, depended on Soviet trucks to keep its logistics functioning. And those Soviet trucks were often more reliable. Soviet engineers built them for Russian conditions. Brutal cold, endless mud, terrible roads. German trucks were built for European highways. Meanwhile, across the front line, Lend-Lease delivered 375,000 Studebaker US-6 trucks to Soviet forces by 1945. American trucks, built in numbers that dwarfed German production, gave the Red Army a logistics advantage that grew larger every month. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer SS, oversaw the integration of captured vehicle fleets into the German logistics network, organizing maintenance depots and spare parts distribution for the mismatched collection of Soviet trucks. The Germans were scavenging to survive. The Soviets were drowning in American steel. August 1942. Stalingrad, 48.7 degrees north, 44.5 degrees east. 6th Army, 250,000 men, pushed into the city for a battle that would consume them. Those 250,000 men required sustained deliveries approaching 20,000 tons per day. The Gross-Transportraum system's theoretical maximum capacity, but theory assumed perfect conditions and 200-kilometer distances. Stalingrad was 300 kilometers from the nearest railhead. MAN ML 4,500 heavy trucks attempted to bridge that gap, hauling fuel and ammunition in convoys that stretched across the steppe. They couldn't do it. The distances overwhelmed the capacity. November 19th, 1942. Operation Uranus. The Soviet encirclement offensive trapped 6th Army in Stalingrad, and the German trucks, including Opel Blitz and Mercedes L 3000, couldn't retreat fast enough. Mud from autumn rains slowed them. Soviet attacks destroyed them. The pocket closed. 91,000 German soldiers surrendered by February 1943, along with thousands of trucks and horses. Horses still hauled the vast majority of supplies, even in this supposedly mechanized battle. The final proof that the Wehrmacht had never escaped its 19th century logistics. The Gross Transportraum system, designed for 200-kilometer distances in Western Europe, completely failed when stretched to 300 kilometers across Russian mud. 6th Army starved and froze, not because it fought badly, but because the trucks couldn't reach it and the horses couldn't save it. July 5th, 1943. Operation Citadel. Kursk, 51.5 degrees north, 36.3 degrees east. Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. 2,700 German tanks massed for the attack, each one a fuel-hungry monster demanding 700 tons per day in combat. The Maultier half-tracks were there. The SDKFZ 251 variants were there. The Busing N AG 4,500 heavy trucks deployed to keep the panzers supplied. And it didn't matter. The distances exceeded 200 kilometers again. The supply system that had worked in France in 1940, delivering fuel and ammunition to panzers racing to the Channel coast, couldn't sustain operations across Russia's vastness. The offensive stalled partially from fierce Soviet resistance, but also from fuel and ammunition shortages. The same logistics failures that plagued Barbarossa 2 years earlier repeated. The Maultiers performed well in their role, hauling supplies through summer mud that would have stopped wheeled trucks. But they represented too small a fraction of the total logistics fleet to matter strategically. The German army needed thousands more trucks than it had. It needed railheads that could advance faster. It needed fuel production that could match consumption. It needed magic. And magic doesn't exist. The Kursk offensive ground down into a defensive battle, then a retreat, then a rout. The trucks that were supposed to supply the advance instead evacuated the survivors. February 1943. The Don River retreats. 48 degrees north, 42 degrees east. Borgward VK 3.02 tracked carriers, 1,000 produced with half-ton capacity, proved their worth in the chaos. These small tracked vehicles could navigate directly through combat zones to recover supplies under fire, something standard trucks couldn't attempt. Summer 1943. Army Group South retreated through Dnipropetrovsk at 48.5 degrees north, 35 degrees east. Captured T-20 Komsomolets, armored tractors. Soviet artillery tractors seized earlier in the war, now towed German guns in retreat. Skoda 606 captured Czech heavy trucks with 6-ton capacity-filled gaps in the collapsing German logistics network. 30% of the truck fleet was lost in February 1943 alone during the aftermath of Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht was cannibalizing itself, using whatever vehicles still moved to save whatever could be saved. Specialized vehicles like the Borgward carriers could navigate fire zones that standard trucks couldn't approach, recovering ammunition and fuel from abandoned positions before Soviet forces overran them. But these vehicles represented a tiny fraction of total needs. For every Borgward that successfully dodged through shellfire to grab supplies, 10 Opel Blitz trucks sat broken by the roadside, waiting for parts that would never arrive. The German logistics system had moved beyond crisis into desperation. Trucks were being abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel to run them or spare parts to fix them. The mule vehicles still worked, but the army around them was disintegrating. June 22, 1944. Operation Bagration, Belarus, 53 degrees north, 28 degrees east, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa began. The contrast was total. Soviet forces equipped with Lend-Lease Studebaker trucks advanced 400 kilometers per day, sustaining offensive momentum that German logistics had never achieved even in 1941. The Studebakers carried fuel, ammunition, food, everything the Red Army needed to keep attacking. They didn't break down. They didn't sink in mud. They just worked. German infantry divisions, still equipped with their 942 motor vehicles each, proved insufficient. They retreated at 50 kilometers per day, maximum. The remaining Maultier half-tracks and Opel Blitz trucks abandoned positions due to fuel shortages before Soviet forces even arrived. There was no point staying to fight if there were no bullets to shoot or fuel to escape with. Operation Bagration destroyed Army Group Center, eliminating 28 German divisions in a single offensive. The destruction came from Soviet tactical superiority, but it was enabled by logistics superiority. The side with more trucks, better trucks, and reliable fuel supplies won. The side that still depended on horses and a patchwork fleet of worn-out vehicles lost. The lesson was brutal and clear. Logistics decided battles. Always had. Always would. And Germany had lost the logistics war in June 1941. Everything after that was just the consequences catching up. January 1945. The Vistula-Oder offensive, Poland-Germany border, 52 degrees north, 15 degrees east. The final accounting came due. Remaining trucks, including captured Skoda, 606 heavy haulers, got abandoned due to fuel exhaustion. There was no fuel left. The refineries were lost. The supply lines were cut. The trucks sat where they stopped, empty metal shells. Of the 625,000 trucks that began Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, fewer than 20% remained serviceable by May 8, 1945. 80% destroyed, captured, or abandoned. The horse losses told an even grimmer story. 600,000 horses at the start, but 1.1 million total lost as replacements were continuously brought in and died from overwork, starvation, and cold. By the war's end, horse strength had collapsed to a fraction of what began the campaign. German logistics had completely collapsed. General Eduard Wagner, the Quartermaster General, who warned about the 200-kilometer limit, became involved in the July 20th, 1944 assassination plot against Hitler. When the plot failed, Wagner committed suicide. The man who understood the numbers couldn't stop the catastrophe they predicted. The Maultier half-tracks, over 10,000 produced, represented brilliant engineering. They solved the mud problem. They worked exactly as designed. But they were only 10% of the fleet. Too little. Too late. The other 90% of vehicles, the standard Opel Blitz trucks and Mercedes haulers and Ford variants and Bussing-Nag heavies, couldn't overcome the fundamental impossibility of the task. You cannot supply millions of soldiers across thousands of kilometers with 1940s technology and limited production capacity. The math doesn't work. Wagner knew it. The trucks proved it. And the horses paid the price. Modern museums preserve what's left. The Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia displays a Maultier half-track and a captured Gaz AA, relics of the logistics war. The Deutsches Panzermuseum Münster shows an Opel Blitz in German colors, restored to showroom condition it never had in service. Military academies teach the 200-kilometer rule as a logistics case study. Don't advance beyond your supply range. Don't assume trucks can replace horses overnight. Don't start a war you can't feed. The Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union with the image of mechanized modernity, gleaming panzers on newsreel footage, the future of warfare. But it depended on 19th century horse logistics for 80% of its supplies. The mule trucks, the Maultiers and half-tracks and tracked carriers couldn't overcome that fundamental contradiction. No vehicle could. The horses at the beginning, starving in the Russian winter, eating the corpses of other horses to survive. That was the reality behind the propaganda. That was the truth the trucks couldn't change. Germany lost the Eastern Front because it couldn't deliver enough bullets, enough fuel, enough food to the men doing the fighting. The shooting war was decided by the logistics war, and the logistics war was over before the first shot was fired.